The autumn rain hammered Chicago's cobblestone streets like machine gun fire, each drop exploding against the grimy windows of Murphy's pub. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the bitter scent of bootleg whiskey that burned going down and left men questioning their life choices. It was October 1924, and the city pulsed with the dangerous rhythm of prohibition, a time when fortunes were made in shadows and reputations died faster than men who crossed the wrong people. Thomas "Tommy" Castellano pushed through the heavy oak door, his worn leather coat dripping steadily onto the sawdust-covered floor. At 32, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of too many nights spent in places like this, too many mornings waking up with blood under his fingernails that wasn't always his own. His dark hair was slicked back despite the rain, and his gray eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who'd learned early that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The pub buzzed with the usual crowd, dock workers nursing their wages away, small-time bookmakers settling debts, and the occasional businessman slumming it for the thrill of danger. Tommy chose a corner table, one that gave him a clear view of both entrances and kept his back to solid brick. Old habits died hard, especially when they'd kept you breathing this long. "What'll it be, stranger?" The bartender, a mountain of a man named Seamus Murphy, wiped down a glass with practiced indifference. His Irish accent had softened after 20 years in Chicago, but it still carried the weight of the old country's troubles. "Whiskey. The real stuff, not that grain alcohol poison you serve the tourists." Tommy's voice carried the rough edges of Chicago's South Side, where he'd scraped together his first dollar and learned that respect was earned with fists, not words. Murphy's eyebrows raised slightly. "Real stuff costs extra, and I don't know you well enough to extend credit." Tommy slapped a $5 bill on the bar, more money than most men in the pub saw in a week. "Poor generous." As Murphy poured from a bottle he kept hidden beneath the bar, Tommy surveyed the room. In one corner, 3 men in cheap suits argued over a card game, their voices rising with each hand. Near the window, a woman in a faded blue dress nursed a gin, her eyes distant and haunted. At the bar, 2 longshoremen compared scars like war medals, each story growing more elaborate with every drink. The whiskey arrived, amber liquid that caught the dim light like liquid gold. Tommy lifted it to his lips, savoring the burn that reminded him of his grandfather's bootlegging operation back in Sicily, before the old man had been gunned down in a street that ran red with more than wine. "You're not from around here," a voice said behind him. Tommy didn't turn, instead watching the reflection in the window as 3 men approached his table. The speaker was tall and lean, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors than honest work required. His companions flanked him like guard dogs, their hands resting casually near their coat pockets. "Chicago's a big city," Tommy replied, taking another sip. "Room for everyone." "Not everyone," the pale man continued, sliding uninvited into the opposite chair. "See, this is O'Malley territory. Has been for years. We like to know who's drinking our whiskey, breathing our air." Tommy finally looked directly at him, his gray eyes flat and emotionless. "O'Malley, never heard of him." The comment sent a ripple of tension through the nearby tables. Conversations faltered, and several patrons began edging toward the exits. In a neighborhood where knowing the local power structure could mean the difference between going home to your family or going home in a pine box, claiming ignorance was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "Patrick O'Malley," the pale man said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "controls the docks, the numbers, half the speakeasies in this district. Ring any bells now?" Tommy shrugged, genuinely indifferent. Should it?" The 2 enforcers moved closer, their intentions clear. The pale man leaned forward, his breath reeking of cheap gin and cheaper tobacco. "Maybe you need an education in local customs, friend. See, strangers who come into our territory, they pay tribute. Call it a welcome tax." "How much?" Tommy asked, his tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than concern. "Everything in your wallet sounds about right." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the proposition. Then, with movements so quick they seemed choreographed, he grabbed the pale man's wrist and slammed it against the table. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the suddenly silent pub like a gunshot. Before either enforcer could react, Tommy had drawn a switchblade from his coat and pressed it against the pale man's throat. "Here's the thing. Tommy said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. I don't pay tribute to men I don't respect, and I sure as hell don't respect men who threaten me over a glass of whiskey. The pale man's eyes widened with pain and fear. You don't know what you're doing. O'Malley will what? Tommy pressed the blade slightly deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. Send more boys with more threats. I've dealt with men scarier than your boss before breakfast. Seamus Murphy watched from behind the bar, his expression unreadable. He'd seen enough violence in his establishment to recognize the difference between bluster and genuine menace. This stranger carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd killed before, and would kill again if circumstances required it. Please, the pale man gasped. And it was just following orders. Tommy studied him for a long moment, then released his grip and folded the switchblade closed. Then tell your boss that Thomas Castellano doesn't pay tribute to anyone, and if he has a problem with that, he knows where to find me. The three men stumbled toward the exit, the pale man cradling his broken wrist against his chest. As the door slammed behind them, normal conversation gradually resumed, though Tommy noticed several patrons stealing glances in his direction. Murphy approached with the whiskey bottle. Another? He asked. Why not? Tommy accepted the refill, his pulse already returning to normal. Violence had long since become routine, a tool no different from a hammer or wrench. Quiet neighborhood you've got here. Was quiet, Murphy replied dryly. Until about 10 minutes ago. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the city, washing the blood from sidewalks and carrying secrets down storm drains that led to Lake Michigan. Tommy settled back into his chair, unaware that across town, in a mansion overlooking Lincoln Park, men were already making phone calls that would set in motion events that would reshape Chicago's criminal landscape. He was also unaware that the name Thomas Castellano carried more weight in this city than he realized, weight that came with responsibilities, debts, and enemies he'd forgotten he'd made. The whiskey tasted good, though, and for now, that was enough. The morning sun struggled through Chicago's industrial haze, casting long shadows across the construction site where Tommy worked. Steel beams rose like the ribs of some massive beast, and the constant hammering of rivets provided a percussion soundtrack to the city's relentless growth. Tommy's hands, calloused from years of honest labor mixed with less honest pursuits, guided red-hot steel into place with the practiced precision of a man who understood that one mistake could mean death, either from falling 30 stories or from disappointing the wrong people. Castellano, the foreman's voice cut through the industrial symphony. Boss wants to see you in the office. Tommy set down his tools and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. The walk to the construction office took him past groups of workers who nodded respectfully, but kept their conversations muted. Word traveled fast in Chicago's working neighborhoods, and by now everyone had heard about the incident at Murphy's pub. The office was a glorified shack perched precariously on the building's third floor, its windows offering a view of the Chicago River, where barges carried steel and coal to feed the city's endless hunger for growth. Behind a desk cluttered with blueprints and coffee-stained contracts sat Frank Torino, a second-generation Italian-American who'd built his construction company through a combination of hard work, political connections, and the kind of flexible ethics that kept projects on schedule. Sit down, Tommy. Frank gestured to a wooden chair that had seen better decades. We need to talk. Tommy settled into the chair, his gray eyes studying Frank's face for clues about the conversation's direction. They'd worked together for 3 years, ever since Tommy had drifted into Chicago looking for steady work and a chance to disappear from certain complications in New York. Frank had asked few questions and paid fair wages, a combination that had earned Tommy's loyalty, if not his complete trust. You stirred up a hornet's nest last night, Frank began, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. Patrick O'Malley's boys have been asking questions about you all morning. Let them ask. Tommy's voice carried the same indifference it had shown the night before. I haven't done anything worth their attention. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Tommy with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. See, that's where you're wrong. Patrick O'Malley doesn't just control the docks and the numbers. He's got connections downtown, judges in his pocket, cops on his payroll. When he asks questions, people answer. And when he asks about Thomas Castellano, Frank paused, taking a long drag from his cigarette. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying with it the weight of unspoken knowledge. When he asks about Thomas Castellano, Frank continued, he gets some very interesting answers. Seems there was another Tommy Castellano in this city, maybe 15 years back. Different man, of course. Older. Had quite a reputation before he disappeared one night and never came back. Tommy's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition that came from deep within memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Common name, he said. A lot of Italians in Chicago. Sure, Frank agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. Lot of Italians. But this particular Tommy Castellano, he wasn't just any Italian. Story goes he ran the South Side back when Patrick O'Malley was still collecting nickels for the parish poor box. Had his hands in everything. Bootlegging, gambling, protection. They called him the Lion, because once he marked territory, nobody else dared hunt there. The office fell silent except for the distant sounds of construction work. Tommy stared out the window at the river, where tugboats pushed barges loaded with the materials that would become Chicago's future. His hands, resting on his knees, showed no tremor, but Frank noticed the way Tommy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Like I said, Tommy finally replied, how's common name? Frank stubbed out his cigarette and leaned forward. Tommy, I've watched you work for 3 years, seen how you handle yourself, how other men react to you even when they don't know why. You've got instincts that don't come from construction work, and last night, when you dealt with O'Malley's boys, Frank shook his head. That wasn't a dock worker defending himself. That was a professional handling amateurs. Tommy stood up, his movements fluid and controlled. You got something you want to say, Frank. Say it. I'm saying maybe it's time you remembered who you really are. Frank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Because whether you remember or not, this city hasn't forgotten, and neither have the people who've been waiting for Thomas Castellano to come home. For a moment, Tommy's carefully constructed facade cracked. Frank caught a glimpse of something deeper, not just the controlled violence that had dispatched O'Malley's men, but the weight of leadership, the bone-deep understanding of power that came from years of commanding respect through more than just fear. It lasted only seconds before Tommy's mask slipped back into place, but it was enough. I don't know what you're talking about, Tommy said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Frank opened his desk drawer and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, South Side Gang Leader Vanishes, and beneath it, a photograph of a younger Tommy Castellano standing beside a black Cadillac, his arm around a woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out. Maria Benedetto, Frank said quietly. Your wife, killed in the crossfire when the Torriani family tried to move in on your territory. You disappeared 3 days after her funeral. Word was you'd gone back to Sicily, or maybe New York. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone agreed. The Lion was broken. Tommy's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Frank thought he might have pushed too far. Instead, Tommy reached for the newspaper clipping, his fingers tracing the image of the woman whose face had been destroyed by time and deliberate damage. She made the best coffee, Tommy said, his voice distant. Used to get up every morning at 5:30, no matter how late I'd been out the night before. Said a man needed proper coffee to face the world properly. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. The weight of command, the constant calculations of loyalty and betrayal, the network of men who'd called him boss and meant it with their lives. And Maria, always Maria, with her gentle hands and fierce loyalty, who died because loving Tommy Castellano made her a target. The Torriani family, Tommy said, his voice gaining strength. What happened to them? Scattered to the winds after you disappeared. Some went to New York, others to Detroit. A few tried to stay in Chicago, but Patrick O'Malley absorbed their territory piece by piece. Frank watched Tommy's face carefully. He's been calling himself the king of the South Side for 15 years now. Built his reputation on the ruins of your empire. Tommy looked up from the photograph, and Frank saw that the construction worker was gone. In his place stood a man who'd once commanded an army of soldiers and controlled territory worth millions of dollars in illegal revenue. The transformation was subtle, but complete, like watching an actor drop one role and assume another. O'Malley, Tommy said thoughtfully, the little Irish punk who used to run numbers for Father McKenna. Not so little anymore, and definitely not a punk. He's got maybe 200 men working for him. Good men who know how to handle themselves. Plus legitimate businesses, political connections, the whole structure you'd expect. Tommy nodded, his mind already working through possibilities and probabilities with the speed that had once made him Chicago's most dangerous man. And my old organization? Gone. Your lieutenants either left town, went legitimate, or ended up in the lake. The infrastructure you built, the network of contacts and safe houses, O'Malley inherited most of it when he filled the vacuum you left behind. The office fell silent again as Tommy processed this information. Outside, a steam whistle announced the noon break, and the sound of hammering gradually diminished as workers laid down their tools and opened lunch pails. Normal men living normal lives, unaware that in a construction shack 30 feet above their heads, Chicago's criminal landscape was about to shift like tectonic plates beneath an earthquake. "There's something else," Frank said finally. "The reason I'm telling you all this." Tommy looked up expectantly. "O'Malley's planning something big. My sources downtown say he's been meeting with families from New York and Detroit, trying to expand beyond Chicago. But there's resistance from some of the old-timers, men who remember when the South Side had different management. They've been waiting for the right moment, the right leader to come back and reclaim what was taken. And they think I'm that leader?" Frank smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Tommy, you walked into O'Malley's territory last night, humiliated his men, and walked out without a scratch. Half the city's talking about it already. The other half is placing bets on how long you'll survive." Tommy folded the newspaper clipping carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. When he looked up, Frank saw something that made him glad he'd chosen to be Tommy's friend rather than his enemy. "Tell me everything," Tommy said. "Every detail about O'Malley's operation, every name, every weakness. And then tell me about these old-timers who've been waiting for me to come home." Outside, the construction workers began returning to their tasks, unaware that the man they'd known as a simple laborer was about to reclaim a throne he'd abandoned 15 years ago. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, and Chicago continued its relentless march toward a future that would be shaped by the ghosts of its past. The basement of Torino's restaurant served multiple purposes. During the day, it stored cases of wine and olive oil imported legally from Italy. In the evenings, it hosted card games where Chicago's Italian community settled debts and formed alliances over hands of Briscola. But tonight, as October rain drummed against the small windows near the ceiling, it served as a meeting place for ghosts returning to life. Tommy descended the narrow wooden stairs, each step echoing off brick walls that had absorbed decades of whispered conversations. The air carried the mingled scents of garlic, aged wine, and cigarette smoke, smells that triggered memories of similar basements, similar meetings, from a time when his word could launch ships or sink them. 8 men waited around a rectangular table covered with green felt. Tommy recognized most of them despite the years that had carved lines into their faces and silver into their hair. These were survivors, men who'd learned to bend without breaking when the winds of change had swept through Chicago's underworld 15 years ago. "Tommy." The greeting came from Salvatore Benedetto, Maria's older brother, who'd served as Tommy's most trusted lieutenant before the collapse. Sal's hair had gone completely white, and his once powerful frame had softened with age, but his dark eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him invaluable. "We heard you were back. News travels fast," Tommy replied, taking the empty chair at the head of the table. The position felt natural, as if the intervening years had been merely a long weekend rather than a complete transformation of his life. "They're faster than you might like," said Vincent Caruso, a thin man with nervous hands who'd once managed Tommy's bookmaking operations. "O'Malley's got people asking questions all over the city. Word is he's not happy about last night." Tommy surveyed the faces around the table, reading the mixture of hope, fear, and calculation in their expressions. These men had survived by adapting to new realities, finding niches in O'Malley's organization, or carving out small independent operations. His return represented both opportunity and danger, a chance to reclaim lost power, but also the risk of being caught in the crossfire of a war they weren't sure they wanted to fight. "Tell me about O'Malley," Tommy said, accepting a glass of wine from Sal. "Everything. How he operates, who he trusts, what he fears. Angelo Torino, Frank's cousin and the restaurant's owner, leaned forward. Patrick O'Malley runs the South Side like a business now. Very organized, very careful. He's got the docks locked up tight. Every ship that comes in pays tribute. Numbers running from Chinatown to the stockyards. Protection for the speakeasies, gambling houses, even some of the legitimate businesses. How many men? Tommy asked. Maybe 200 who work for him directly, replied Michael Romano, a stocky man who'd once served as Tommy's enforcer. Another 100 or so who work jobs when he needs them. Good men, most of them. They know their business. Tommy nodded, processing the information. In his day, he'd commanded similar numbers, but the city had been different then, more fragmented, with territory carved up among dozens of small operators. O'Malley appeared to have consolidated power in a way that would have been impossible during Tommy's original reign. What about the other families? He asked. The Irish from the North Side, the Jews from Maxwell Street. Uneasy truce, Sal replied. O'Malley's strong enough that nobody wants to test him directly, but not so strong that he can expand into their territory without a fight. It's been stable for years, which is good for business but bad for ambition. Tommy smiled slightly. Stability was the enemy of opportunity. Men who'd grown comfortable with predictable arrangements would be slow to adapt when those arrangements suddenly changed. He's got legitimate fronts, Vincent continued. Construction company, trucking business, even owns a piece of a bank downtown. Makes him harder to touch legally, gives him political connections. Who are his key people? Angelo pulled out a piece of paper covered with handwritten notes. His right hand is Sean O'Brien, tough Irish kid from the old neighborhood, completely loyal, handles day-to-day operations. Then there's Marco Torriani. Tommy's expression darkened. Torriani, I thought that family scattered. Marco's the old man's nephew, Michael explained. He stayed in Chicago, worked his way up in O'Malley's organization. Smart, ruthless, holds a grudge. He's the one who convinced O'Malley to absorb the Torriani assets instead of destroying them. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy. The family that had killed Maria and driven him from Chicago now provided muscle for the man who'd claimed his throne. It was the kind of circular betrayal that characterized the world he'd left behind, where yesterday's enemies became today's allies based purely on calculation rather than principle. Where does O'Malley live? Tommy asked. Big house in Lincoln Park, Sal replied. Guards, but not too many. He's got a wife, 2 daughters. Tries to keep them separate from the business. Sends the girls to Catholic school. Takes the family to Mass every Sunday. Tommy filed this information away. Men with families were both stronger and more vulnerable than those without. Stronger because they had reasons to be careful. More vulnerable because they had people to protect who couldn't protect themselves. What about money? How much does he take in monthly? Hard to say exactly, Vincent replied. But our estimates put it somewhere around $50,000 a month. Maybe more. The docks alone probably generate $20,000. In 1924 dollars, $50,000 monthly represented serious wealth, enough to buy judges, police captains, and politicians. It also represented serious vulnerability, because that much money required complex systems to collect, count, and protect it. Complex systems had weak points. Here's what I don't understand, Tommy said, leaning back in his chair. If O'Malley's so successful, so well established, why are you all sitting here talking to a dead man? Why risk everything for someone who walked away 15 years ago and might walk away again? The question hung in the air like smoke from Sal's cigarette. These were practical men who'd survived by making smart choices, not sentimental ones. Tommy needed to understand their motivations before he could trust their loyalty. Because he's not one of us, Sal said finally. O'Malley, he's Irish. He's political. He thinks like a businessman instead of a soldier. There's no respect anymore, no tradition. Just profit margins and efficiency reports. The old ways meant something, Angelo added. Honor meant something. A man's word was his bond. Now everything's lawyers and contracts and bureaucracy. Tommy understood. These men weren't just nostalgic for their lost power. They were mourning the death of a culture, a way of conducting business that had evolved over generations of immigrant families trying to survive in a hostile world. O'Malley represented not just a different leader, but a different philosophy entirely. Plus, Michael said with a grin that revealed gold teeth, the bastard's been skimming off our operations for 15 years. Some of us would like to collect interest on that debt. This was more honest, and Tommy appreciated the candor. Revenge and profit were motives he understood better than honor and tradition. What about weapons? He asked. We've got access, Vincent replied. Nothing fancy, but enough to handle ourselves if things get unpleasant. And safe houses. A few, mostly outside O'Malley's usual territory. Tommy stood and walked to one of the small windows, looking up at street level where pedestrians hurried past in the rain. He could see their feet and the lower portions of their coats, anonymous fragments of lives being lived without awareness of the conversation taking place beneath their feet. And if we do this, he said without turning around, it won't be like the old days. O'Malley's got structure, political connections, legal fronts. We can't just walk into his operations and take them over by force. What are you thinking? Sal asked. Tommy turned back to face the group. We make him remember why Chicago used to be afraid of Tommy Castellano. But we do it smart, piece by piece, until he's fighting shadows instead of enemies. Over the next hour, they outlined a preliminary strategy. Tommy would continue working construction, maintaining his cover as a working man with no ambitions beyond his next paycheck. Meanwhile, the others would begin reaching out to their contacts throughout the city, testing loyalties and identifying opportunities. One more thing, Tommy said as the meeting wound down. And nobody moves without my say-so. Nobody takes independent action. We're either all in this together or we're not in it at all. The men nodded agreement, though Tommy noticed Vincent's slight hesitation. In the old days, Vincent had occasionally shown initiative that bordered on insubordination. Tommy made a mental note to watch him carefully. As the meeting broke up and the men filed upstairs to the restaurant proper, Sal lingered behind. Tommy, he said quietly, there's something else you should know. What? Maria's grave. O'Malley had it moved when they expanded the cemetery for a construction project. She's in Holy Cross now, in the section for paupers. No headstone, just a number. Tommy felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Moving Maria's grave wasn't just bureaucratic efficiency. It was deliberate insult, a way of erasing his legacy by erasing the woman who'd been closest to him. So thank you for telling me, he said. Sal nodded and headed for the stairs, leaving Tommy alone in the basement with his memories and his slowly awakening anger. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and preparing it for whatever came next. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Chicago, the kind of morning that made men question their life choices and reach for their first drink before their first cup of coffee. Tommy stood in the Holy Cross Cemetery, rain dripping from his coat onto the soggy ground, where Maria's unmarked grave lay somewhere among dozens of similar plots marked only with faded numbers painted on wooden stakes. He'd found the cemetery records through Sal's connections. Maria Benedetto Castellano, Plot 247, Section G, buried with the dignity afforded to those whose families couldn't afford marble angels or bronze plaques. The deliberate slight cut deeper than Tommy had expected. In the old days, Maria's grave would have been a shrine, visited by associates paying respect not just to her memory, but to the power she'd represented by proxy. You deserve better than this, he whispered to the muddy earth, then turned and walked back to his Packard, a recent acquisition that signaled his transition from construction worker back to something more dangerous. The morning's first target was a modest storefront on Halsted Street that housed Murphy's newsstand, one of dozens of small businesses that paid O'Malley's organization for protection. The owner, an elderly German immigrant named Klaus Weber, arrived precisely at 7 o'clock to open his shop, just as he had every morning for the past 12 years. Tommy waited until Weber had turned on the lights and arranged the morning papers before pushing through the front door, the bell overhead announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that contrasted sharply with his serious expression. Good morning, Weber said automatically, his English heavily accented but clear. What can I get for you? Information, Tommy replied, approaching the counter where Weber stood behind a cash register that had seen better decades. Do about your protection arrangements. Weber's face went pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he recognized the type of conversation this was going to be. I don't know what you mean. Tommy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Klaus, it is Klaus, isn't it? Let's not waste each other's time. You pay Patrick O'Malley's people $20 a month to make sure your windows don't get broken and your customers don't get bothered. Simple business arrangement. How do you? Weber's voice trailed off as he realized the futility of denial. I know because it's my business to know. Tommy picked up a copy of the Chicago Tribune and scanned the headlines. More political corruption scandals. More bodies found floating in the lake. More evidence that the city's appetite for violence remained undiminished. The question is whether you'd prefer new management. Weber glanced nervously toward the street, as if expecting O'Malley's men to materialize through the window. I can't. Mr. O'Malley has been fair to me. No trouble in 12 years. Fair. Tommy set down the newspaper and fixed Weber with a stare that had once convinced harder men to reconsider their positions. $20 a month for protection you don't need, from threats that wouldn't exist if you didn't pay the protection. That's not fair, Klaus. That's extortion with better marketing. The old man's shoulders sagged slightly. Like most small business owners in neighborhoods controlled by organized crime, he'd long since accepted the protection payments as simply another cost of doing business, like rent or insurance. The idea that alternatives might exist hadn't occurred to him in years. What are you offering? He asked cautiously. $10 a month, same protection, better service. Tommy pulled out a business card, plain white stock with nothing but a phone number printed in black ink. Any problems? You call that number, day or night. Weber stared at the card as if it might explode. And if Mr. O'Malley objects to this arrangement, let me worry about Mr. O'Malley. For the next 20 minutes, Tommy explained the transition process. Weber would continue paying O'Malley's collectors for the next 2 weeks, giving Tommy time to establish the new arrangement properly. After that, when O'Malley's men came for their monthly collection, Weber would politely inform them that he'd found alternative protection services. They won't like it, Weber warned. No, Tommy agreed. They won't. But they'll accept it. From Weber's newsstand, Tommy drove to 3 more businesses, a barber shop, a small grocery store, and a tailor shop. The conversations followed similar patterns: initial fear, gradual curiosity, and eventual acceptance. By noon, he'd established the foundation of his new protection racket, offering better rates and more reliable service than O'Malley's organization. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than challenging O'Malley directly, Tommy was undermining him economically, one small business at a time. The monthly income loss wouldn't cripple O'Malley's organization, but it would get his attention and force him to respond, creating opportunities for further exploitation. Tommy's next stop was the First National Bank of Chicago, a massive limestone building downtown, where men in expensive suits moved other people's money with the solemnity of priests conducting mass. He'd called ahead to arrange a meeting with Jonathan Hartwell, a vice president who'd been helpful to certain business interests during Tommy's previous incarnation. Hartwell's office occupied a corner of the bank's 3rd floor, with windows overlooking LaSalle Street and walls lined with law books that probably hadn't been opened since the Cleveland administration. The man himself had aged better than most, his silver hair and conservative suit suggesting prosperity without ostentation. Mr. Castellano, Hartwell said, rising from behind his mahogany desk to offer a handshake. I heard rumors you were back in Chicago. I must admit I'm surprised. Surprised I'm alive or surprised I'm here? Both, frankly. Hartwell gestured toward a leather chair facing his desk. After you disappeared, there were all sorts of theories about what happened to you. Most people assumed you'd met the same fate as your competitors. Tommy settled into the chair, noting that Hartwell seemed genuinely pleased to see him rather than nervous or suspicious. That suggested the banker hadn't developed any inconvenient loyalties to O'Malley's organization during the intervening years. I needed some time away from the business, Tommy said, but circumstances change. Indeed they do. Hartwell returned to his chair and opened a file folder that had been sitting on his desk. I took the liberty of researching your previous accounts after your call this morning. Interesting reading. Tommy waited while Hartwell reviewed whatever documents the folder contained. Banking relationships in the criminal world required delicate negotiations. Institutions needed plausible deniability, while criminals needed reliable services. Men like Hartwell served as bridges between those competing requirements. According to our records, Hartwell continued, You maintained several accounts with us from 1908 until 1909, when they were closed and the funds transferred to a bank in New York. Substantial amounts, even by our standards. I had substantial interests in those days. Yes, well, I'm sure you're aware that business conditions have changed significantly since then. Federal oversight, new regulations, more scrutiny of certain types of transactions. Tommy nodded. I'm not looking to recreate the past, Jonathan. Just establish a foundation for future opportunities. For the next hour, they discussed the practicalities of setting up new accounts, establishing lines of credit, and creating the financial infrastructure necessary for Tommy's return to power. Hartwell proved surprisingly accommodating, perhaps recognizing that Chicago's criminal landscape was about to shift and wanting to position his institution advantageously. One more thing, Tommy said as the meeting concluded. I'll be needing information about certain other accounts, transactions involving Mr. Patrick O'Malley's various business interests. Hartwell's expression became carefully neutral. That would be irregular. Client confidentiality is one of our most sacred principles. Of course. Tommy reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope containing $500 in cash. I wouldn't want you to violate any principles. Let's call this a consulting fee for general market research about Southside business conditions. Hartwell glanced at the envelope, his practiced eye estimating its contents. General market research. Yes, I suppose we could provide some insights about economic trends in various neighborhoods. I knew you'd understand. As Tommy left the bank, he felt the familiar rhythm of his old life reasserting itself, the careful cultivation of relationships, the strategic application of pressure and reward, the patient construction of power networks that could withstand challenges from competitors and law enforcement alike. O'Malley had built his organization using similar methods, but he'd made the mistake of believing his success made him untouchable. Tommy's final stop of the day was a warehouse on the south side where Sal had arranged to meet with representatives from 3 other families interested in Tommy's return. The building stored grain shipments from Midwest farms, and the air inside hung thick with dust and the earthy smell of wheat and corn. The representatives were cautious men who'd survived 15 years of O'Malley's rule by keeping low profiles and avoiding unnecessary attention. They controlled small territories, a few blocks here, a couple of businesses there, but their combined resources could provide significant support for a larger operation. The way we see it, said Carlo Russo, who ran numbers in Little Italy, O'Malley's gotten too comfortable. He takes his tribute, but he doesn't provide value anymore. No protection from the feds, no help when other families encroach on our territory. What kind of help are you looking for? Tommy asked. Same thing everyone wants, replied Antonio DeMarco, whose family controlled several restaurants and a small trucking company. Respect, fair treatment, a piece of the bigger action instead of table scraps. The conversation continued for an hour, with Tommy carefully probing each man's capabilities, ambitions, and limitations. By the end, he'd secured tentative agreements for intelligence sharing, mutual support, and coordinated action when the time came to move against O'Malley directly. As evening approached, Tommy returned to his modest apartment near the stockyards, a deliberate choice that maintained his cover as a working man while providing easy access to the network of contacts he was rebuilding. The apartment was spartanly furnished, containing little beyond the necessities of daily life, and a locked trunk that held weapons, cash, and documents from his previous incarnation. He poured himself 3 fingers of genuine Irish whiskey, ironic use given his current target, and settled into his one comfortable chair to review the day's progress. 4 businesses recruited, financial infrastructure established, alliances formed with 3 smaller families. Not bad for a dead man's first day back to work. The telephone rang at precisely 9 o'clock, its shrill tone cutting through the apartment's silence like a knife. Tommy let it ring twice before answering, his voice carefully neutral. Yes. Is this Tommy Castellano? The voice was unfamiliar, with the flat vowels of Chicago's Irish neighborhoods. Depends who's asking. Name's Sean O'Brien. I work for Mr. Patrick O'Malley. He'd like to meet with you tomorrow night, discuss some mutual business interests. Tommy smiled, though O'Brien couldn't see it. Word of his activities had reached O'Malley faster than expected, which suggested the Irish crime boss had better intelligence networks than anticipated. It also suggested he was taking Tommy's return seriously enough to attempt negotiation before resorting to violence. Where and when? Tommy asked. Salvatore's restaurant on Taylor Street, 8 o'clock. Come alone. I'll be there. The line went dead, leaving Tommy alone with his whiskey and his thoughts. Salvatore's was neutral territory, an old-style Italian restaurant frequented by businessmen, politicians, and criminals who needed to conduct conversations away from prying eyes. The choice of venue suggested O'Malley understood diplomatic protocol, even if he'd never learned to respect the traditions that protocol represented. Tommy finished his whiskey and began preparing for what might be the most important meeting of his newly resurrected career. Tomorrow night, he would sit across from the man who'd claimed his throne and built an empire on the foundation of Tommy's abandoned kingdom. The conversation would determine whether that empire could be reclaimed through negotiation or would have to be taken by force. Outside his window, Chicago settled into its nightly rhythm of commerce and crime, unaware that the balance of power that had defined the city's underworld for 15 years was about to be tested by a ghost with a very long memory and an even longer list of debts to collect. Salvatore's restaurant occupied the ground floor of a 3-story brick building that had housed Italian families and their businesses for over 30 years. The dining room featured red checkered tablecloths, wine bottles converted into candle holders, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured, only earned through decades of serving real food to real people who understood the difference between sustenance and performance. Tommy arrived at 7:45, early enough to assess the environment but not so early as to appear anxious. He chose a table with clear sight lines to both entrances and positioned himself, so his back faced the kitchen, where the sounds of preparation would mask any approach from behind. Old habits survived long retirements. Patrick O'Malley entered at precisely 8 o'clock, and Tommy immediately understood why the man had succeeded in claiming his abandoned territory. O'Malley moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, his expensive overcoat and well-tailored suit suggesting prosperity without ostentation. At 45, he'd maintained the lean build of his youth while acquiring the gravitas that came with power, responsibly exercised. 2 men accompanied him, Sean O'Brien, whose voice Tommy recognized from the previous night's phone call, and a darker-complexioned man who carried himself with the controlled stillness of professional muscle. They took positions at nearby tables, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to maintain the illusion of privacy. Mr. Castellano. O'Malley extended his hand as he approached Tommy's table. Thank you for coming, Mr. O'Malley. Tommy stood and accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact. Whatever else O'Malley might be, he wasn't a coward. They settled into their chairs as a waiter appeared with menus and a bottle of Chianti that neither man had ordered but both accepted as part of the restaurant's ritual hospitality. The wine was poured, pleasantries were exchanged about the weather and the quality of the food, and the careful dance of negotiation began. I'll be direct, O'Malley said after the waiter had retreated. Your return to Chicago has created some complications for my organization. What kind of complications? The kind that cost money and create uncertainty among people who prefer predictable business arrangements. O'Malley lifted his wine glass but didn't drink, instead studying Tommy's face for reactions. 4 of my clients have switched protection services in the past 2 days. Small accounts, admittedly, but the principle concerns me. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Competition is healthy for any market. Keep service providers focused on customer satisfaction. True. But when that competition comes from someone with your reputation, it tends to make people nervous. Nervous people make poor decisions, which is bad for everyone's business. The waiter returned to take their dinner orders. Veal marsala for O'Malley, osso buco for Tommy, both dishes that would require careful attention and couldn't be rushed. The choice of slow-cooking entrees suggested both men expected a lengthy conversation. Tell me about my reputation, Tommy said once they were alone again. I'm curious how history remembers me. O'Malley smiled slightly. History remembers Tommy Castellano as a man who controlled the South Side through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his enemies' moves. They called you the Lion, not just because you marked territory, but because you defended it with absolute ferocity. Past tense. Tommy observed. Until last week, yes. Past tense seemed appropriate for a man who'd been gone for 15 years. O'Malley leaned forward slightly. But here's the interesting thing about reputations. They have a way of outliving the men who build them. Even after you disappeared, your name carried weight in certain circles. Men who'd worked for you, fought against you, or simply heard stories about you. They never quite forgot. Tommy sipped his wine, acknowledging the compliment while considering its implications. Reputation was currency in their world, but it was also a burden. Men remembered Tommy Castellano as dangerous, which meant they would approach him cautiously, but they also remembered him as someone who'd abandoned his empire when the cost became too high, which meant they might question his commitment to seeing things through this time. "So what are you proposing?" Tommy asked. "Partnership." O'Malley's answer came without hesitation, suggesting he'd given this considerable thought. "You have experience, reputation, and connections that would be valuable to my organization. I have infrastructure, political relationships, and resources that could support your ambitions." "What kind of partnership?" "You handle special projects, situations that require your particular skill set. In return, you receive a percentage of profits from territories you help acquire or maintain, plus autonomy to run your own operations within agreed-upon boundaries." Tommy considered the offer while their food arrived. It was generous by most standards: recognition of his abilities, financial compensation, and operational independence. It was also completely unacceptable for a man who'd once ruled the territory O'Malley now claimed as his own. "Interesting proposal," Tommy said, cutting into his osso buco. "But it assumes I'm interested in being a junior partner in my own kingdom." O'Malley's expression didn't change, but Tommy noticed his grip tighten slightly on his fork. "Your kingdom, as you call it, ceased to exist 15 years ago. What I've built since then is something entirely different. More organized, more profitable, more stable. Built on the foundation I left behind. Partially, yes. But foundations don't make buildings. That requires architects, contractors, and years of careful work." O'Malley paused to take a bite of his veal. "I'm not diminishing what you accomplished in your time, but time moved on. Chicago moved on. The business evolved." Tommy smiled, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, he let O'Malley see a glimpse of the man who'd once inspired fear throughout the South Side. "Evolution is an interesting concept, Patrick." "May I call you Patrick?" "Of course. Evolution suggests adaptation to changing circumstances, but sometimes circumstances change again. Sometimes what people thought was extinct turns out to have been merely dormant." The conversation continued through dinner, with both men probing each other's positions and capabilities. O'Malley proved to be intelligent, well-informed, and surprisingly philosophical about the nature of power and its temporary nature. Tommy found himself genuinely respecting his opponent, which made what was about to happen almost regrettable. "I have a counter-proposal," Tommy said as they finished their meal. "You withdraw from the protection business on the South Side, maintain your other operations, and we divide the territory based on historical precedent." O'Malley laughed, a genuine sound that drew glances from other diners. "Historical precedent?" "Tommy, with all due respect, you're proposing that I voluntarily give up territory I've controlled for 15 years because you've decided to come back from the dead. That's exactly what I'm proposing. And if I decline?" Tommy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, which he placed on the table between them. "Then things become complicated." O'Malley opened the envelope and extracted a series of photographs and documents. His expression grew progressively darker as he examined their contents. Images of his family's daily routines, his daughters, school schedules, bank records showing financial irregularities in his legitimate businesses, and a detailed organizational chart of his entire operation with notes about each key player's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. "How did you—" O'Malley began, then stopped himself. The question was irrelevant. What mattered was the message. Tommy Castellano was back. He was serious, and he'd spent the past week systematically dismantling O'Malley's sense of security. "Your family is beautiful," Tommy said conversationally. "Your daughters have your wife's eyes. St. Catherine's is an excellent school, very safe neighborhood, good security practices." O'Malley's face had gone pale. but his voice remained steady. "If you're threatening my family, I'm not threatening anyone, Patrick. I'm simply demonstrating that I've done my homework." Tommy leaned back in his chair. "The South Side was mine long before it was yours. I'm offering you the chance to return it gracefully, with compensation for your inconvenience and guarantee of safe passage for your other operations." For a long moment, the only sounds in their corner of the restaurant were the clinking of silverware and the murmur of other conversations. Tommy could see O'Malley calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find an alternative that didn't involve surrendering territory worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. "You've been gone for 15 years, O'Malley said finally. "The men who worked for you are old, retired, or dead. The politicians who protected you have been replaced. The police who looked the other way have new commanders. What makes you think you can simply walk back into a world that's moved on without you?" Tommy smiled and pulled out a second envelope, this one containing photographs of the past week's meetings, Weber's newsstand, the bank conference with Hartwell, the warehouse gathering with the other families. Each image was time-stamped and included detailed notes about the conversations that had taken place. "Because I never really left," Tommy said. "I just stopped being visible." O'Malley stared at the photographs, recognition dawning in his eyes. The network Tommy had supposedly abandoned had actually gone underground, maintaining connections and waiting for the right moment to resurface. The protection racket, the banking relationships, the family alliances, they hadn't been destroyed by Tommy's disappearance, merely suspended until his return. 15 years, O'Malley whispered. "You've been planning this for 15 years. Not planning, waiting." Tommy gathered the envelopes and returned them to his coat. "Planning suggests urgency. I had all the time in the world." The waiter appeared with coffee and small glasses of grappa, the traditional end to a proper Italian meal. Both men accepted the drinks, though the convivial atmosphere had long since evaporated. "What happens to my people?" O'Malley asked. "In the men who've worked for me, built their lives around my organization. The smart ones will adapt. The loyal ones will be protected. The stupid ones," Tommy shrugged. "Darwin was right about evolution. The species that survive are the ones that adapt to changing conditions." O'Malley lifted his grappa glass and studied its contents, as if seeking wisdom in the clear liquid. "You know, I always wondered what happened to you. After your wife died, after you disappeared, there were dozens of theories. Some people thought you'd gone back to Sicily. Others figured you'd started over in New York or San Francisco. What did you think? I thought you'd broken. I thought losing her had taken something essential out of you, something you needed to survive in this business." O'Malley drained his grappa in one swallow. "I was wrong." "No," Tommy said quietly. "You were right. Losing Maria did break something in me, but broken bones heal stronger than they were before, and 15 years is a long time to heal." They finished their coffee in silence, two professionals acknowledging the end of negotiations and the beginning of something else entirely. When O'Malley finally stood to leave, he paused beside Tommy's chair. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry about your wife. She didn't deserve what happened to her." "No," Tommy agreed. She didn't." O'Malley walked toward the exit, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. At the door, he turned back for a final comment. "Tommy, the South Side you're reclaiming. It's not the same place you left. The city's changed. The people have changed. Even the business has changed. You might find that being king of a different kingdom isn't what you expected." Tommy raised his wine glass in a mock toast. "There's only one way to find out." After O'Malley departed, Tommy remained at his table for another hour, sipping wine and watching the restaurant's other patrons enjoy their evening meals. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their city's criminal landscape had just shifted like geological plates beneath an earthquake. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, he would visit Holy Cross Cemetery and tell Maria about the conversation that had just taken place. She'd always been his best advisor, even if she could no longer answer back. Outside, Chicago settled into its nightly rhythm of commerce and crime, while somewhere in Lincoln Park, Patrick O'Malley sat in his study considering options that ranged from accommodation to war. The lion had returned to his territory, and the South Side would never be the same again. The waiter brought Tommy his check along with a complimentary glass of aged grappa. Some compliments of the house. Mr. Castellano, he said with a slight bow. It's good to have you back. Tommy tipped generously and walked out into the Chicago night, where the October air carried the promise of winter and the certainty of change. 15 years ago, he'd walked away from power because the cost had become unbearable. Now he was walking back toward it, older, wiser, and absolutely determined to make O'Malley understand that some debts could only be paid in territory and blood. The game had begun again, and this time, Tommy Castellano intended to win it permanently.